Hey, PreSales Collective, it's your host, James Kaikis, and today I'm going to be joined by Kelley Pidhirsky, Manager of Solutions Engineering at DocuSign, and Emily Dunn, Manager of Sales Engineering at Pendo. The topic of today's episode is Promotion to Leadership, Part 2. This is a fun one because Kelley becomes our first repeat guest. Kelley was on Promotion to Leadership, Episode 11, where she talked about her journey of being promoted at DocuSign. Fast forward a couple months, we want to check in with Kelley to see how her leadership journey is going and if her perspective has changed. And Emily was just promoted to a leadership role within our company 6 weeks ago. And so we're going to talk about what her transition has been like and her philosophy. And the dynamic of today's episode is really fun because we just want to come into the episode and talk about leadership generally and how leadership perspectives change as time goes on. And so you're going to hear some really interesting things from both Kelley and Emily. If you are an individual contributor and you're thinking about leadership, you can soak in and say, wow, I'm glad that I'm hearing this and knowing this. Or if you've been a manager for only a short time, you can maybe hear a few things and figure out if you need to redefine how you look at leadership. And if you're a leader who's been in your role for quite some time, or you're an executive leader, think about what the mindset is of your new employees or first-time leaders and how they're approaching the role and the perspective. Enjoy. Today's episode is sponsored by Consensus. Scale your pre-sales organization with interactive video demos. Experience an interactive demo at goconsensus.com. Kelley and Emily, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. How's it going? Kelley, how's work going? How are you?
Hi, James. It's so great to be back here to get to chat with you again. Things are great. We are in 2021. We made it.
It is crazy. I can't get over that. It's like already January, February now, but I'll get there, right?
Absolutely.
How is work going for you? I mean, now that you're a manager in Q4's got to be a little bit different, huh?
It is. It's good. I'm really enjoying getting to see so many more of the bigger deals, getting that higher level perspective as opposed to just being focused solely on the ones that I would typically be involved in. It's really exciting to get to see it more so across our segment and see all of these different types of deals that we've been working so hard on throughout the year and beyond coming to fruition.
It's always an exciting time, always a bit nervous, but we're glad to have you back. The first repeat visitor to the PreSales Podcast. That's a good thing, I'd say. So welcome back.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you.
Emily, welcome to the PreSales Podcast. Congratulations on your promotion.
Thanks, James. I'm really excited to be here.
How is Q4 for you? Because you're recently promoted, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but how is Q4 going? Is it a full manager position at this point? Or you feel like you're hands-on trying to save the day? What's Q4 like for you?
Well, I mean, it's been about 6 weeks. So there are still deals that I am working on in the SE capacity rather than a manager capacity, trying to get them through to close. So it's interesting. It's kind of a hybrid Q4 for me at this point.
How has that been? Do you feel like you have one foot in one area, one foot in the other, and can't give all your attention to both components? Or are you just kind of like, hey, this is the nature of the transition and are okay with it?
I would say that the first 2 weeks, it felt like I was doing two jobs because literally I got the offer on a Monday and I started on a Tuesday. So there was no time and I already had meetings scheduled. So I made a pretty hard line in anything that was too early to pass it off. But yeah, those first 2 weeks were a little bit insane. It feels a little bit more reasonable now. There will be days where I have customer meetings and I feel more like I'm doing my old job. And then other days where I'm not talking to any customers at all. So I definitely feel like it's manageable and it certainly keeps things interesting here in the beginning.
I bet. Well, it's good that you set expectations. Did you set that line with your internal team and your management as well?
Yeah. So my manager put together like an official transition plan on paper, right? It makes it real, something you can refer back to. But I have a good relationship with all of the AEs I had worked with, right? So they were all very understanding. And previously, I would work on more of the enterprise mid-market deals. And the team that I'm overseeing works more of our SMB segment. So some of the deals that I had been working have been a great opportunity for me to tap a few members of my team on the shoulder and say, hey, come work this bigger deal with me. Gives you some more experience, gives me the opportunity to not be the sole person on it, but also has that continuity for the prospect who's already met me. That's also been an interesting opportunity.
Well, I want to dive into all of this. So today's episode is titled Promotion to Leadership Part 2, because this is a follow-up to Kelley's promotion, and we had her on the podcast 6 months ago. So I want to talk about what the transition has been like and what 6 months into the role has changed. And for you, Emily, I want to talk about your promotion path and really just have a good conversation between the three of us, because I'm sure Kelley has advice and some thoughts on things that she thought 6 months ago that have completely changed. So we're going to start, Emily. I'd like to hear about your promotion path. So for you, and for those listening, you were at Pendo, you left for a short time, and then you came back to Pendo, and then you got promoted within a year. So one, congratulations. That's an awesome story. Those boomerang stories are always great. But tell me about this promotion. Was this planned? Was this something that you wanted? Break that down for us.
It definitely was something that I had started talking with my VP pretty much right when I came back. It was something that I was interested in. Before I left, I kind of felt at that time with my career at Pendo, I'd been at Pendo for so long. It was like, hey, I can either choose the fork in the road where I go learn and see if I can prove myself on another product, one that's actually more technical than the one that we have today, or I can start developing and going down the management path. And at that time, I actually took the other fork. I went that route. I feel like I succeeded. I just didn't find it interesting and I missed Pendo. So I had a rare opportunity in life to head back down one path and take the other fork in the road. And, shortly after I came back at the end of January 2020. Obviously, COVID hit 6 weeks later. So everything changed and the conversation pretty much was put on hold for a good while.
And how did that conversation come back up? Was that something that was a need as the organization was growing, or you kind of brought that up saying, hey, this is the next step that I wanted, this is what I wanted previously. Walk us through that.
So we actually had our P left the organization and then our director took that role. And the new VP, we had actually put out a director hire, or I guess a director rec, if you will. And he actually was like, you know what? I think instead of doing a director as a backfill for me, I'd like to do 2 manager positions. And so when I saw that director role come open, even though it said it needed way more experience than I had, which was 0, I applied. So it was very easy to transfer that into a manager role that I was interviewing for.
That's amazing. Congratulations on that. So what did moving companies teach you about what you liked about Pendo?
It's funny because I actually put together a pros and cons list. It was actually something that I did before I moved over. So I started my career in sales, being an AE. And when I moved over to be an SE, I had this spreadsheet of all the things I loved about sales, all the things I hated. Would I get to keep them? If I was an SC, I scored them between 1 and 5, and then it spit out numeric scores. I remember showing that to the VP at the time. He's like, well, you're definitely a sales engineer.
Absolutely.
I never did that when I left Pendo, but I did it when I was thinking about coming back. And every time I've done that, I've never regretted the decision I've come up with. I think all that to say, right, I had very specific things that were important to me that I came back for. But I think it's really about those intangible things. I know it sounds really hokey and everyone says this, but the culture was a big deal. Maybe part of it too is the fact that I had started at Pendo as employee 16. So I had been there for forever, and the culture that Pendo had was something that I sort of helped shape. So it's easy to feel comfortable in that. But also there was something to be said about being a remote employee at the time. And my direct team wasn't remote. My husband wasn't working from home either. It was kind of lonely going to a new company and being remote in the house by myself. So coming back was actually, the idea of being able to go back into the office and having friends at work that I could interact with on a regular basis was really appealing to me at the time. And then ironically, COVID hit. So I got about 6 weeks of that, but it still feels different now because everyone's remote and it doesn't feel as isolating as it did at the time.
I love that, right? Because I think we take for granted culture at times. Culture in companies grows and changes. And sometimes the grass isn't always greener on the other side.
I agree. I was just about to say the same thing. I don't think that's hokey at all. And if somebody thinks it is hokey, then that's crazy because we spend more time with our work than we do with our actual family on any given day. Especially with everything going on now, I think that culture is more important now than ever. So I'm with you.
Kelley, in our last episode, you talked about the value of getting a promotion within your own company because you knew the landscape, you knew where to go and how to go. And since that episode, I think that's really resonated with me because I've gotten some people say, hey, I want to get into leadership. What should I do? And it went from hey, I would look to get a leadership job where you can get one to I would try to get promoted within your company because you know the landscape. What are your thoughts on that perspective?
No, I feel exactly the same way. In fact, now more than ever for several reasons. And I'm going to set COVID aside because hopefully this podcast will live long past COVID. Emily, there's several things. You said something earlier on that really resonated with me as well. One of my concerns when I really finally got to the point where I was able to move into leadership was I knew I wanted to move into leadership, but I also really did love my individual contributor role. And one of the things I loved about it was being able to make such a direct impact for our customers and prospects. So similar to you, Emily, I had a little bit of a transition period where I was kind of doing those two jobs, which is really hard, but I don't want that to scare anybody because it actually, as crazy as it was, it helped me with that transition, kind of easing out of one role and into another. So that part I wanted to make a quick note of. It can be a little daunting at first, but you'll get there. And it helped with that transition. And then secondly, not having quote unquote actual manager leadership experience, if you will. I do really think it helped me from a credentialing perspective, especially when we've had other leaders join our team from outside of the company. I have reached out directly with them and kind of partnered up with them and said, hey, you have leadership experience, but you don't have DocuSign experience. I have DocuSign experience, but I don't have leadership experience. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And it's worked out really, really well in every sense, where I can go to them for advice, they can come to me, and vice versa. It's helped me to keep my confidence levels up in trying out different aspects of the leadership role and still feeling personally fulfilled that I can help my teammates because I have been in their shoes. I have been through those same challenges. So it's been really good because for those of you that are listening and thinking about going into leadership, it can be scary day in and day out. There's some days that, I feel a little bit better than others. And so having that experience of knowing my company makes it a lot easier. I think about if I were to try to learn how to go into management and learn everything about a new product, new company, dynamics, new people, that would be a lot more daunting to me. Not that it's not doable, but this, for me, was very, very helpful.
Absolutely. I mean, I have two comments on that. Number one, I am really excited at putting that particular advice into practice. So when I did leave Pendo, I went and worked for a boss that I really enjoyed working for. And we were fortunate enough to just get him to come over and be the other manager on our team.
That's awesome.
So it's kind of like a former mentor, if you can call it that, since it was such a short period of time, but somebody I really respected as a manager is now going to be more of a senior manager on our team, obviously somebody I can look up to, and I can advise him on Pendo, the ways of Pendo, and obviously he can advise me on all the other things that I don't know. But that comment, I would say, is super helpful just to think about, teaming it up like that. Because honestly, the hardest part for me so far has really been kind of not knowing how to define success. Now, I know it's only been 6 weeks, but I do believe that as sales engineers, we do have a competitive nature where we want to succeed. But, even coming from sales prior to that, there was always some sort of numeric measurable thing about your role. How much revenue did you contribute to? How many deals are you working? How many meetings have you had? Everything now is so much more squishy. I don't have the ability to look back on my day and say, wow, I had 4 customer calls and this person, was so excited. And I think that this deal is going to close. Like, there's none of that. So
good technical term, squishy.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Just really kind of being able to look to someone else who does have that experience externally, I think is really huge.
That's a great journey. And you both provided a ton of actual insights because you're right. You need to find someone that you can be safe with. You can have a conversation and be vulnerable because we all have questions. No one knows how to do everything perfectly, but sometimes we're almost afraid, at least in my case, where I don't want to look bad, right? I don't want my manager to think like, oh, well, this person doesn't know what they're doing or doesn't know how to actually handle this. And I think that's a transition that many leaders go through in their first couple of years as they're defining their leadership style. Because for me, I always thought, well, everything has to be running perfect. And if someone says it's not, it's a reflection on me. But what I realized that there's always an opportunity to get better. And, seeking out somebody's advice will allow for you to get better and to change. And as companies evolve, as teams evolve, you have to be constantly changing and improving. What you did 3 or 4 years ago may or may not make you as successful today. And something Kelley brought up last time on the podcast that has continued to resonate with me is building your executive board. And the idea of finding people that will be your allies, but will give you straight advice, radical candor around that. And that's, I think, for PreSales Collective too, and my role at Salesforce, those are 2 different executive boards, and they allow for me to have different conversations with those individuals. And it's been great for me. And so I love that you guys are doing that and building that rapport and that partnership because we need other people to be better and to grow, in my opinion.
And I say this to my kids as well. You always want to surround yourself with people that are going to help you to become a better person and vice versa. It's important throughout life and certainly in your career.
Back to one point that you had, though, about being at the company and having, I guess, expertise within DocuSign. I just feel like people are going to be less likely to take a chance on you to really hire you as a first-time manager from the outside. Being at a company for years really, I think, makes a difference when people are trying to think about promoting within.
Oh, yeah.
I do think, in the tech world, we do have a culture of, hey, I've been at this company now for 18 months to 24 months. It's, I guess, time to move on to the next company, right? And there's certainly value in moving organizations and getting different experience. But I think if you can find someplace that you love and that you really align with the culture, then if you really are aspiring to become a manager, putting in that time is going to give you more of an opportunity to get that promotion than if you try and just apply blindly to other organizations for your first manager role.
I like that. And I want to dig on this because what advice do you have, Emily, for people who have been at a company for a couple of years? They feel like they're putting in the work, but they feel that the opportunities aren't presenting themselves and they're growing frustrated. I know of a couple of people that are in this situation, and it's hard to tell someone to be patient. It really is. It's hard to tell someone to be patient when they want to move on and aspire. And like, what's that breaking point? So what thoughts do you have there?
I did really enjoy Kelley's commentary in the last session about making sure your goals are known, working with your manager. Like, I would never have gotten promoted if it weren't for my manager. It feels weird calling the VP a manager, but I would never have gotten that without him. I would never have gotten it without having my own personal brand within the organization. But I do think that there's something about, like, you can state that your goal is to get promoted, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get promoted. Just because you put it out there doesn't mean that you're a good fit. And I do feel like at a certain point, if your bosses, managers, whether they're direct or not, aren't coming to you and saying, what's the next step for you? Are you interested in this? Then that might be a sign that they're not even thinking about you for that. And that's really where, instead of even just going and saying, I want to be a manager, you can go and say, what are the skills that I'm missing? Because maybe there is something that they're seeing that you don't realize that you can work on. And it's probably hard to provide unsolicited constructive feedback around why you're not management material. So you have to ask for that kind of information.
And if I can add on to that too, because that's such a great point, Emily, I feel really strongly about this. I had a boss a long time ago that said, I don't know what I don't know. And at the time, I was like, okay, I get it. But it really makes a lot more sense. The expectation that your boss is going to come and tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, James, I see you over there working really hard. Now it's time for you to step up and take on that next role. Those days are gone, unfortunately. You need to play an active role in being an advocate for yourself and you bringing that conversation up to your manager. They're not always going to come to you and say, hey, Emily, what's your next step? You should be having those one-on-one meetings and sharing your goals. And that way, to your point, Emily, if you're having these conversations over time, it is easier to say, maybe you should think about developing this area, or maybe I can help you with developing that, or we've got a program that you can go through, or a person I can introduce you to so that it's not a surprise. I like to think that the onus should be on yourself. And if it comes to you as a surprise, then look back on your conversation. So bring that topic up early and often so that you can figure out where to course correct sooner and not be caught in that surprise later on. Now, granted, managers could have changed. Maybe someone new comes in. I totally get it. And that's a whole other scenario. But if you have that consistency of that ongoing boss, bring that conversation up early and often.
Kelley, I like that perspective. I want to ask you a very specific question what is your perspective on leader readiness when it comes to your day-to-day? Because I've been going through this thought process myself. If somebody does everything in their job description really, really well, is that enough to get them to leadership when you have other people that might not be the strongest or not doing things as well, but are going above and beyond in so many other ways? That makes me feel like they're more attractive of a candidate because they're putting a little bit more in and going the extra mile. And I feel like that could translate well. But at the same time, if they're not doing everything well, or even as good as some people on the team, I go back and forth on like what actually matters. Do you have a perspective there?
A very strong one. This is a hot topic for me. And some folks might not like my answer, but I do feel very, very strongly about this. If you show up every day and you do a great job according to your job description, then you're doing a great job for your job description. That to me is not saying that that's going to make the next best leader. I do like to look at what I refer to as your extracurricular activities. If you want to kind of compare it back to when you're in high school and you're applying for all of those top colleges, they want to see that well-rounded individual. And I think that's a great way to look at it from this perspective. We expect you to be doing a good job. That's why you were hired into this role. A leadership role is different. Your job description for a leadership role might be changing every day. So having those, again, quote unquote, extracurricular activities, if you will, and some examples might be like what we're doing with the WISE program, James, getting involved in different programs throughout the organization, whether it's employee resource groups, different employee activities that you can get involved in, whatever the case may be, to show that you are well-rounded is important for those that are hiring you to see that you can take on different activities, but it's duly beneficial for you because it's going to give you exposure to different situations and certainly different people that will then be in your corner so that, again, when it does come time for you to get that promotion, it should be a no-brainer. But I think if you think about it in that context, if you're doing a great job in your job, that's what you're supposed to be doing. You need to be expanding that horizon for your own personal growth and to also be showing in that concept of always be interviewing every day that you can take on different challenges, unexpected things along those lines and building out that brand.
And I like what you said there because I know that you did a lot of work with WISE and that kind of gave you that leadership experience without having the direct experience. And I really do think that those things will teach us about ourselves and teach us how we actually want to lead when we're in that situation. Emily, do you have a specific situation at Pendo that was kind of like that defining moment of going above and beyond and allowed for you to really stretch yourself and say, hey, I can do this leadership role, or I can make a bigger impact than I'm doing today?
Yeah. I mean, I do feel like that's just kind of in my nature. Again, it does help that I've been at Pendo for forever. I have no fear in seeing a problem, putting together a deck on the problem, and then asking a director of product to like come look at it. I feel like that's where it's a lot harder to be new in an organization. You're not going to do that. I just have the connections, if you will, to be able to do that. That's something that I did. A lot of other little things. I'll give you two very specific examples. One as a learning of what I did wrong, and one is where I learned some stuff and actually then did it right. So one is specifically around something we wanted to change in our demo environment. I'll keep it vague here. We had been wanting to change this for months. At the time, like when I first brought it up, I was like, let me just let other people do it. I feel like it's a really good learning opportunity for other people to go in and build all this new stuff because it kind of gives them a good sense of the product. Well, lots of competing priorities happen and months go by and we hadn't released this yet. Eventually, I just came in and I took over. I did it. I tested things. I actually went in and made sure that it got done. But I actually had been recommended in reading this book by our CRO called Multipliers. It's by Greg McKeown and Liz Wiseman. Really love it. Lots of insights there. But as I was reading this book, I realized that everything that I did in that situation with that project was the wrong way to do it. So it's basically this concept of being a multiplier and multiplying your people versus diminishing them. And coming in, taking over a project, doing it myself is the exact wrong thing to do as a leader. And I definitely learned that throughout reading that book. Felt like they were talking about me, Emily the Diminisher.
I keep that book with me at my desk.
It's gold.
We got to get these people on a podcast, James.
I know. We need to call that. Multiplier is a great book. Greg also writes Essentialism, which is a really good book too for leaders. It talks about removing the noise. And so I think both books are really great. Multipliers is a fantastic read. And it really does make you self-reflect. And you're like, wow, how many times did I do things incorrectly and probably hurt along the way? Like actually before this podcast, we were talking about leadership and how advice has changed. And I look at myself from 10 years ago and think, man, I was probably such a diminisher at times. And some of the things that I did probably did not allow for the growth of my employees as it should have. And I think that's what I love about leadership is because it does change and does evolve. And you get to learn more about yourself and where you can make an impact and how you can help people grow. And at the end of the day, like that's what this whole thing's about.
That's like the importance of these types of podcasts for people, because one of the big things about this book is, yes, there's this concept of diminishers, but also accidental diminishers. Again, you don't know what you don't know. We all make mistakes. And so I think, Emily, I know you've still got more to talk about there, but that's exactly what this is about, learning from each other. PSC is about making those connections so we can help to learn from this.
Honestly, I think most people are accidental diminishers, right? I don't think a lot of people wake up as leaders and say, how can I stifle my people today? But I did take those learnings, right? So one of the things that I had come to realize is that we did a really good job in our organization in talking about the new feature release, what it is, why it's valuable, but we didn't really sit down and teach the reps who had to demo for themselves, especially how to demo it, how to use the right reports, what to use in our demo environment. So I reached out to our sales enablement team and organized this demo days concept where an SE would spend 30 minutes every other week actually talking about a specific feature and how to demo it specifically. After reading that book, I, instead of doing it myself and saying, here's Emily teaching you how to demo something, which I could certainly do, I asked some of my colleagues to do it. They would lead the session and they've been amazing at it. But I think that was a big thing is I had probably already had a reputation within Pendo as being somebody who got stuff done, but maybe also was kind of like a steamroller, like a know-it-all, if you will. And this was my opportunity to show that if I was taking off that IC hat and putting on a manager hat, that I could let other people do things, right? That I could step back and actually help guide a program or a project without having to execute it necessarily myself.
Yeah. You know what I will say though, as someone who spent most of his career in startups, is it almost becomes a part of the environment, because so many people wear so many different hats in those startups that you actually become that accidental diminisher, where you just are used to executing on work and getting things done, and you don't know how to empower people. And also the sense of urgency that exists in a lot of these smaller companies can really affect the way that you lead. And so I do a lot of reflection on myself in my 4+ years at Showpad, because I was one of the first hires and I helped build the global team. And I look back at myself and I'm like, wow, like that's something I wish that I did differently. And then I think about the culture and the environment and how we were growing so quickly that that's what happened. It's hard to take a step back. It takes leaving the role, going to a different company and doing it a little bit differently to really get that perspective.
Not to take this down too far of a path, but along that accidental diminisher line, I think that's actually one of the strengths of an SE. I mean, my college days are just a little bit behind me, but again, to make that comparison, I bet you that anyone that's listening to this podcast, anytime you had to do like a group project, there's a 99% chance that everyone that's listening said, yep, I was the one that always ended up taking on all of the work. I think that's just kind of a trait of, a good SE. So back to that concept of accidental diminisher, similar to you, Emily, delegating does not necessarily come naturally to me. And it's not necessarily because I'm a control freak or anything like that.
It's okay if you are, I am too. This is a safe space.
There you go. The safe space between the three of us and the internet. But I actually feel bad in many cases. I kind of project on other people, oh, well, they're really busy, so I feel bad taking up their time, and trying to reframe that as well. One of my mentors, Leah McTiernan, who's a big PSC participant, she helped me in looking at that as well, of some of these opportunities, Kelley, that you took on, didn't they help you in many different ways? And I said, of course. And she said, well, flip the way that you look at this. Instead of feeling bad about asking people to do things, recognize that when you ask them to do things, it's giving them that same opportunity that you had. And that was extremely helpful for me. So if anybody's concerned about delegating, that's something helpful to do as well, and start to remove that accidental diminisher perspective. A huge mindset shift when you go from IC into leader.
That's a great perspective, Kelley, and I appreciate you sharing that. And on that topic, you've been in your role now for a couple of months and a couple of quarters. Has your definition of leadership changed? What is different for you now than it was when you first took that promotion?
That's a great question.
It's a loaded, tough question.
Where do I even begin with that? So much has changed.
That is the answer, that so much has changed and your perspective of leadership has already changed in a short amount of time.
Yes, it really has. I mean, again, I moved into this role right before COVID happened. So there's all of that. With your point, James, of so much has changed, I don't even know where to begin.
How about the people management of it? Because you actually got promoted to lead the team that you were on. And I think that's one of the hardest things that you could do, in my opinion. And I know that your organization and your team and your leaders supported you so that it seemed like an easier transition. But at the end of the day, those people were your peers, even if they looked up to you, and now you manage them. That's an entirely different dynamic.
Absolutely. And I will say that I'm extremely fortunate because, to Emily's point earlier, having been here for a while, I have had relationships with many of those people that were my coworkers that now are on my team, which still sounds weird to say. But I also think that, again, having those long-term conversations with my leadership helped, because having different opportunities to take on roles where I might be leading a project or a session or whatever the case may be helped to mold that perception in advance so that it wasn't a shock to the system of the team when I got the role. It was more supportive. I do feel very fortunate because I've seen it in many cases where it is not nearly that easy. It's really not. And it can be very, very difficult and very uncomfortable. But I think that's, again, an area that's important to be always interviewing, not just interviewing up, but creating that brand across everyone and building that trust and building that respect, if you will, across all the different levels.
Thank you, Kelley, for that. It's really interesting. And I'm glad that you've had a great transition that talks a lot about your leadership and your culture and the environment that you work in that allows you to be successful. Emily, from your perspective, has anything changed? I know that you're still only 6 weeks in. Is there something that has surprised you that you weren't anticipating?
We've been talking a lot about like different projects and delegation. I've been surprised by the amount of project management skills I would need. I actually feel like it's the first time where I have had people who have had ideas, and it's my responsibility to get those ideas into action, as opposed to I used to have ideas. I would bring them to someone else, hope that something would happen, right? Or I'd execute on it myself if it was a self project and just make it happen, right? But now it's like I'm responsible for getting things to happen while also not being able to be the one to necessarily make them happen, if that makes any sense. It's like a lot of responsibility, not very much control. And it was kind of the complete opposite. So that was kind of surprising for me. I do think that I've been very lucky, and I'm sure that a lot of people would say this, but the team that I inherited, I didn't hire any of these folks. They're all really easy. Everybody just performs their job. I mean, I do believe that sales engineers in general are just more high performing employees as a whole, because we have to be. We're kind of like the unicorns to be able to have technical knowledge and basic social skills, sales acumen, things like that. So like from an actual management perspective, I've been really, really lucky that nothing there has surprised me. It's been more around the other stuff that I just mentioned.
It goes back to your point earlier of the importance of a good culture too.
That's true.
James, if I can add in one last thing here, it's first of all an honor to get to come back and join another podcast, and an even bigger honor to get to be on here with you and Emily. So thank you for inviting me back again. One of the things I did want to add in, now that I have had the opportunity to be in for a little while now, is just a shout out to any moms and dads or parents or caretakers that are out there that are thinking, I feel like I'm at a point in my career where I want to take that next step, but perhaps my kids are young and I worry about it. And I think I brought this up perhaps on our last podcast, but I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. And of course, it's crazy right now. In general, it's a crazy time of life, but with online learning and is school going to be open or not and all that kind of stuff, it can be daunting. However, I just want to encourage anyone that's at that point in their life, because I had someone explain it to me really, really well one time. The first, let's say 10 or so years of your career, you're often just being able to dump everything into work. You don't necessarily have the responsibilities of kids, of family, home ownership, or anything along those lines. So your number one priority can be work. And you just work, and get to that spot. And then finally, when you're in that quote unquote spot where you can take that next step, life often happens. You're getting married, you're buying a house, you're having kids, your parents might be getting ill. There's so many other demands in life, and it can really make you stop and hesitate of thinking about taking that next step. And it absolutely did for me. But I have to say, one of the things that has been probably the most surprising is actually having my kids and the EQ that's developed for me, and how applicable that has been in my role. This role is much less black and white. When you're an SE, the answer is yes or no. You click here, or that product doesn't exist, or it's on our roadmap. When you're a people manager, it's 50 shades of gray, literally, because you're dealing with people's emotions. And so I think about my own kids' emotions, already by drop off this morning for school. I think I had happiness, tears, anger, laughter, all those different emotions all wrapped up into one. And it's actually, I think, a great quality to have when you go into a leadership role. So I just wanted to add that little extra encouragement for any folks that might have young kids that are thinking, gosh, I don't know if I can really take on another big change and where's my focus supposed to be. Don't let it hold you back. In fact, let it be a big benefit for you.
Kelley, I appreciate that perspective because I know that there's a lot of people out there listening that those types of things are holding them back. Well, Kelley and Emily, thank you both so much for your time. This has been a very exciting episode, a great conversation. I hope people listening will find a lot of actions and takeaways from this. So just want to say thanks. Congratulations again, Emily. Good luck for the end of your Q4, and we'll see you guys next time.
Bye, James.
Thank you.
All right, PreSales Collective. I really enjoy recording these episodes because you get to talk to other pre-sale leaders and people that are making an impact and hearing their stories and hearing their perspectives in the way that they do things. We don't do the PreSales Podcast just to do it and build the name of PreSales Collective. Our goal for every episode is to make sure that you walk away with something. Regardless of your role or your experience, you learn something and you have a takeaway and have a new perspective. And hearing Kelley and Emily's journeys was really refreshing. I wish I had that type of perspective when I entered leadership, and it took me a lot longer to learn the things that they do and that they know early on. It's the giving back aspect of the podcast and PreSales Collective that we just love so much. I really mean that. And I really hope that, again, if you're an individual contributor and you're looking to make a leadership move, that you can listen to today's episode and some of the other episodes catered around leadership and start defining your style and what you would do in that role. It is very clear that if you are going to get promoted within your organization, you need to have allies. If you listen to Paul Baptiste's podcast, having a sponsor goes a long way because those people are really looking out for you. And you got to build your executive board because there are so many amazing people in this profession. And this profession is starting to grow and gain more awareness that it gets a little bit more competitive. And understanding how you can get to your goals while also fitting in the company's growth timelines is a bit of a puzzle. And when Kelley talked about the pre-sales role and going above and beyond, I love that she talked about it as a college application. When you're applying to college, it's not just what your grades are, but your extracurricular activities, writing your essays, doing these other things that showcase who you are as a person and your philosophy. You don't have to be the best SC to be a good leader. And vice versa. You could be a great leader and not the best SC. That happens. I love that they talked about the book Multipliers. If you have not read Multipliers, I highly suggest it. I'm a big fan of essentialism as well. A leader asked me to read it in my career, and it allowed me to kind of cut the noise out. And that's also written by Greg McKeown. Multipliers is a fantastic book that will change your perspective on leadership. And again, we talked about the accidental diminisher. Nobody walks into work with bad intentions. I'm going to steamroll these people, or I'm not going to let them do their job. It just sometimes becomes a part of the culture or a part of the day-to-day. And you need to read and understand philosophies like this that will allow you to be able to hear that, absorb it, understand how you're doing that in your day-to-day to get better and to grow. The last thing I'll leave everybody with is a leader told Kelley that I don't know what I don't know. And that is a really interesting outlook on things. If you're sitting here waiting for your leaders to reach out to you to know what your next step is, I'm going to challenge you to get introspective and understand what is your next step? Why is it your next step? And how do you get there? And start socializing that, build those allies and build people that will help get you to the position that you want to be at. All right, PreSales Collective, I hope you enjoyed today's episode as much as I did. As always, like and share the podcast, and we will see you next week.